So good morning and welcome everyone to the next Socio-Technical Cybersecurity Lecture Series at the University of Maryland iSchool. I'm Sean Jansen, PhD candidate and coordinator of this lecture series. If you'd like to know a bit more about us, please check us out at go.umd.edu/STC. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our STC speaker, Shaheen Talish. Professor Talish is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work spans law, sociology, and political science. His research interests include the empirical study of law and business organizations, dispute resolution, consumer protection, insurance, and the relationship between law and social inequality. Professor Talish's most recent empirical studies address the intersection between organizations, risk, and consumer protection laws. Professor Talish's scholarship has appeared in multiple law and peer-reviewed social science journals, including Law and Society Review, and has won multiple awards in sociology, political science, law, and society. He is also the director of Law and Graduate Studies program and interdisciplinary JD and PhD program at the UCI School of Law. Also joining us on the webinar in the background is his co-author, Brian Cunningham. Please note that to direct all of your questions to the Q&A, you can stack the questions up during the talk, but we will answer questions during the Q&A session after the presentation has taken place. A chat will be made available where you all can talk amongst yourselves, but we will not be actively taking questions through the chat or directing comments there until the Q&A portion at the end. So at that point, go ahead and take it away, Shaheen.
Okay. Thank you, Sean, and thank all of you for coming. I want to recognize Sean for coordinating this and Sarah Grun for helping with the sort of logistical issues. And thank all of you for attending. I know this is an interdisciplinary group. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, so hopefully we can have a fruitful exchange. This is a very, very, very new paper. It's first time presenting it, so really looking forward to getting feedback on this. And let me share my screen before we sort of move forward. Get my slides up here. Okay. This project is also a collaboration, as Sean mentioned, with my co-author, Brian Cunningham. Brian is an attorney. He's also executive director of our Cybersecurity Research and Policy Institute at UC Irvine. Has international experience, worked in the CIA, NSA, in the White House, has been invaluable in terms of his expertise on cybersecurity issues. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a little background and then situate this within my larger research agenda and then go into the project and try to get to our findings from this study. So for those of you who don't know, in general, my research agenda centers around studying how private organizations respond to legal regulations and what effect these responses have on consumer and civil rights in terms of procedural fairness and substantive justice, if you will. Typically, studies of business compliance with law view law as very top-down. That is, they think of law as formed and defined outside of organizations by courts and legislators, and the role of organizations is limited to reacting to law by either complying or not complying. And what I write about a lot is law from the bottom up, how private organizations are often shaping the content and meaning of laws that are designed to regulate them. So in the last 5 to 8 years, I've been pivoting and importing my organizational analysis into studies of insurance law and looking at how insurance companies play a very much a mediating role in how organizations comply with laws and thinking about laws more generally, and thinking about insurance companies as legal intermediaries between formal law and how law is implemented on the ground. So I've done a study on employment practice liability insurance. I did an early study on cyber insurance that led to the collaboration with Brian and I on this larger project. So this paper is putting into conversation the insurance and the insurance industry with technology, AI, big data, et cetera. As we all know, AI, predictive analytics, big data are taking over society in many respects. Governments, businesses, banks, advertisers, schools, healthcare, finance, policing are turning to emerging technologies, right? Proponents, of course, say that these technologies provide businesses insights and perspectives on customers, increase efficiency, offer competitive advantage, improve use of existing products and services. Opponents, of course, argue the opposite, right? That this corporate usage and exploitation of consumer information threatens privacy, data security, Moreover, state and private sector producers of surveillance technologies cultivate an environment where very little is private. Look, this is debatable whether these interventions are transformative, disruptive, harmful, but what isn't debatable, I think, is that the pivot toward technology in society is irreversible, right? And so although scholars are exploring the ways that code, technology, and information regulate society, existing research across many economic sectors and aspects of society primarily are focusing on the theoretical and normative challenges of big data and emerging technologies. In the legal academy in particular, it's very normative, very theoretical. We lack a lot of scholarship on how these tools operate and what's happening on the ground, right? And this isn't due to a lack of interest, but rather the secrecy and lack of disclosure by data providers, data harvesters, and corporations that use, collect, and sort of utilize these technologies, if you will. And efforts by the government have been largely unsuccessful, as well as consumer advocacy organizations. So, to our knowledge, there's been little empirical analysis of precisely how big data and technology influence important aspects of society. What are their, that's what's largely the big question of this paper and this project, right? We're trying to offer a deep dive empirical exploration of how big data and emerging technology shape and influence the delivery and practice of one particular industry that relies heavily on technology and big data, and that's the insurance industry, right? The fusion between technology and insurance is commonly referred to as insurtech, right? And is really transforming the delivery of insurance, right? In this article, we focus on how insurers are engaging one of the most important threats to businesses and individuals in society, cybersecurity risks and data breach events, right? Looking at cyber insurance, if you will. As most of you on this call probably or on this Zoom are aware, one of the biggest threats facing businesses and consumers are data breach and cybersecurity risks, if you will, right? And in the past 5-10 years, we've seen all kinds of organizations subject to breach events, et cetera. Tremendous loss of money, loss of privacy. As a result, there's been an expansion in the number and kind of privacy laws, regulations, and industry guidelines that organizations are subject to. Compliance hurdles via HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley. States have notification statutes requiring organizations notify promptly consumers of breach events at great expense. Others are turning to lawyers to sue in court with mixed success, limited success. Despite the sort of legal, reputational, financial, survival threats, prevailing empirical research suggests that private organizations are not drastically changing their behavior. They have formal policies in place, but the majority of organizations do not believe they're sufficiently prepared for a data breach, have not devoted adequate money, training, and resources to protect consumers' electronic or paper-based information, and fail to perform adequate risk assessments. Many more organizations express what's called a compliance fatigue, if you will, dealing with all of the various rules and regulations, if you will, in play. And so recognizing this under preparation, under compliance gap, insurance field has stepped in the last decade and began offering cyber insurance. Okay, this is designed to provide both first party and third party liability coverage for data breach events, privacy violations, and cyber attacks. There's variation in the types of policies being offered, but most provide some risk shifting for the costs associated with having to respond, investigate, and defend against the consequences of a data breach or cybersecurity event, right? Now, organizations are increasingly purchasing this insurance, whereas most companies didn't have cyber insurance a decade ago. Now about a third, possibly starting to push up beyond that, have cyber insurance. Now, insurance companies are offering not just risk transfer, but with this insurance, they offer risk management services aimed at improving an organization's cybersecurity profile and reducing their risk. And so in this respect, cyber insurers are playing a quasi de facto regulatory role over their insurance. And my earlier work in 2018 tried to, at least at an early level, try to tease that out a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit about more of this in this talk. So technology and data are transforming the delivery of insurance in the cyber context because unlike many traditional lines of insurance, cyber insurance lacks significant amounts of loss history and actuarial data to rely on when making risk assessments. So, because cyber is so new, cyber insurance is so new and uncertain, and cybersecurity, the threats or attacks from cyber attackers are constantly changing. Actuarial data to rely on is limited, and cyber insurers covet data from data providers, right? Cyber insurers are turning to big data, AI, predictive analytics to assist in the underwriting and the risk and the claims management processes, and as a result, redefining the business of insurance. And so, our focus in this study is right here, how big data, emerging technologies shape and influence the delivery of cyber insurance, and what are the effects or implications of that reliance, if you will, right? And in doing so, we hit or engage a couple of big debates in the insurance world, which is, how do insurers in this day and age manage uncertainty concerning underwriting risks? And how are insurers using technology to some extent to regulate the behavior of businesses that use this insurance or buy this insurance? Okay. So the study draws from 60 interviews with members of the cyber insurance field, a quantitative analysis of a big data set that we obtained from a cyber insurance data provider, observations at cyber insurance conferences, and evaluating and coding cyber insurance company applications that purchasers fill out, right? And so the paper essentially tries to identify and explore the effects and implications of what we refer to as the technologization of insurance, right? The process whereby technology influences and shapes the delivery of insurance. And so we try to reveal how these technologies are mechanisms through which insurers manage uncertainty and regulate the behavior of their policyholders. Now, to be clear, we're not suggesting that all insurers rely heavily on technology, but rather that those that do in the cyber insurance field, based on our research, use it in the ways that I'll articulate in a few moments, right? And the paper presents itself as sort of two phases, right? Phase one explores how technology is actually shaping the delivery of insurance, particularly for insurance brokers and carriers. And we suggest, at virtually every stage, it's playing a role in transforming the delivery of insurance. And then phase two looks at the effects and implications of that, right? And there, although there's a lot of reliance on these technologies in transforming the manner in which insurers advertise, underwrite, price, et cetera, the actual impact on insurer behavior seems to remain minimal. We find that insurtech interventions and innovations have been to date at least largely ineffective at enhancing organizations' cybersecurity and assisting insurers in managing uncertainty in the market, right? And then we conclude the paper by offering a series of recommendations on how the private sector can maybe operationalize technology for greater safety and security of consumer information, as opposed to, efficiency and profit are the sort of more traditional models. And we look at some more fully integrated insurtech models that are starting to work through some of the problems that we've already identified in our effects or implications section. So that's like an overview of the paper, of the project. If you haven't read it, it just saved you a couple of hours of looking through pages and footnotes, etc. The paper has a background section that I'm actually going to really move really quickly to, because I actually want to present the data. And so, we talk early on in the paper about insurtech and big data's emergence, right? The innovative use of technology in insurance, blockchain, peer-to-peer usage, on-demand insurance, the digitalization of the insurance process, how big data is analyzed through a series of modeling, machine learning, and how algorithms are driving analytics, right? And we're trying to replace traditional functions in marketing and underwriting, claims handling, et cetera, right? And the paper talks about some early insurtech innovators like Lemonade, Slice, Spire, and the footnotes. And this is a growing field, right? And the financial investment is heavy. As I say, so almost 17 billion in investments in the last decade, and it's going up. It's not going down, right? Look, and we try to give a background, sort of situate the reader, right, on the pros and the cons of the technology in the insurance space, right? The pros, it helps with speed. It's inexpensive to collect information. It personalizes the underwriting practices, and thus, in theory, it leads to price optimization. Big data allows you to look at way more variables than simply age or address or zip code. Possibly, it allows the ability to engage in loss prevention and risk mitigation in the form of telematics in car insurance, wearable devices, right, that we're all aware of. It gives a real-time feel to it, if you will. Cons, right? There's been debate about this rise in insurtech. Errors in the data itself, selection bias, inaccuracy, subjective judgment, right? Algorithm bias. Potentially the insurer engaging in too much control over insured behavior, right? So there's a debate, right? It's sort of a new thing going on. There's a debate going on, right? We try to sort of situate you within that debate, if you will. And then you say, well, what about law, legal regulation of insurtech? Well, weak, fragmented, and limited would be the short, right? States' regulations are focusing on ways to expand insurtech, creating regulatory sandboxes, trying to incentivize innovations. Many insurtech companies are partnering with larger insurers, so they have to avoid some of the licensing requirements needed to sell insurance in particular states. The NAIC, National Association of Insurance Commissioners, sort of a quasi-regulatory body, exploring the rise here, forming task force. But the bottom line is, look, state laws traditional insurance laws not really created to address these problems that result from technological advances from insurers. And the federal, due to a lot of things I don't want to get into, federal law really doesn't play a huge role in this space. Now, so where we left, if you will, is that there are a lot of normative debates on the role of these technologies in this space, but they're based on assumptions to some extent on what we think is happening, right? A little actual data on sort of what's going on here, right? And so, the project is trying to fill that space. It's also trying to fill more of a debate among the academics in the world about thinking about insurance as a form of regulation, right? Insurance as a gatekeeper to certain activity, right? Insurers require you to have insurance to purchase a car, require you to have insurance to, get a business, a CGL policy to get a business going, et cetera. They engage in sort of a regulatory intervention at times, and sort of looking at cyber insurers as de facto regulators in light of the passive legal interventions that take place from formal law, and looking at sort of how insurers manage uncertainty, right? And sort of then in the technology space, sort of really trying to dig in on what's going on with these technologies from less of a theoretical and more of an empirical space, right? So the methods here are multi, and we triangulate it, which I think is the way to go in these kinds of studies when you're trying to figure out what's going on in a particular area. 60 semi-structured interviews with field actors in the insurance space, and I think here we did a really good job of really capturing the players in the field. We talked to underwriters, brokers, risk managers, actuaries, data scientists, information security providers. We really mapped the field pretty well, I think, and talked to a variety of different people. We observed and attended 8 cybersecurity conferences where the field comes together and allows us to explore how the industry thinks about data breaches, privacy laws, discuss the important issues, advise each other, how they advise each other on practices. We did content analysis of insurance applications to explore how insurers are evaluating and accounting for the prospective insured security measures in the underwriting process. And of course, I mentioned that we access big data, right? One of the biggest obstacles to conducting research about big data is that the information is hard to obtain, right? Cyber insurance is an emerging field, so most brokers lack historical and actuarial data to assess cyber risk. So they're relying on commercial third-party databases developed by data providers that compile this information, right? And so we got access to some of that. We accessed one provider, we purchased access, and we looked at records of cyber events from that the database puts together, right? It's organized in peer groups. They use this to form simulations to understand the estimated impact of cyber breaches on a company of a particular size, industry, right? And it's possessing a number of records, right? So insurance brokers use this data to recommend policy limits for prospective buyers by running simulations on similarly situated buyers. And insurers use data to develop the actuarial models, right? They often either supplement or combine with their own data. And we ran a series of simulations looking for patterns and inconsistencies, assessing the utility of the database, determining whether and how much coverage is appropriate, and really trying to tease out whether the database is used as a tool to sort of encourage buyers to purchase insurance or not, or how's it being mobilized, if you will. So that gives you sort of a sense of the methods for this project. And so then, now I'll sort of present the research in a series of phases, as I mentioned. So phase one is sort of mapping out sort of the technicalization of insurance, which we see the process whereby the practice and delivery of insurance in this space, underwriting, risk management, et cetera, is influenced and shaped by technology, right? As I said, due to the lack of reliable actuarial data over decades, there's a real need here, right? And moreover, cyber attackers are constantly modifying their tactics and evolving, right? And the insurance application that buyers purchase often is incomplete and unreliable. And that's what at least the people that we spoke to says. So, they're managing uncertainty in the field with this data, right? They're turning to technology. And what do we mean by that? Big data providers, information security companies, or managed security companies to assist, predictive analytic companies, forensics companies, okay? Insurance companies and brokers are partnering with companies, or in some instances, bringing these tools in-house to develop their own security tools. Now, interestingly, there's a differentiation in how this technology is used among small, medium organizations and large organizations, right? Small being sort of revenue less than 250 million, let's say. Insurers rely less in that situation on the rigid, mechanical, check the box insurance application. They're conducting security scans conducted by insurance companies, or more often third-party companies, information security companies that contract with insurance companies and replace this sort of old methodology for evaluating the risk, if you will. Large organizations still receive a more high-touch interaction where it's the insurance application, perhaps a scan, but also a meeting to discuss the customers or the prospective clients' cybersecurity health. And sometimes sophisticated companies will hold a sort of a bidding war or competition, if you will, among various insurers, right? So then you say, okay, well, how's data playing out? Well, it plays out sort of in technology playing out in this space, plays out in sort of three different ways. One, you have the data providers who are aggregating data on claims and events that have already occurred. That's one category, if you will, right? They're collecting information on thousands of claims and losses from public records and non-public information provided by brokers and carriers, insurance companies, and then they sell that aggregated information back to insurers and brokers, attempting to understand the extent of the cyber insurance market and the types of breaches that may be reasonably expected, right? So you see here a little quote here by one about how, the purpose, if you will, helping to assist in creating underwriting and pricing models, right? As I said, smaller insurers seem to be more heavily relying on these big data providers. There's like 3 to 4 of them in the space, if you will, in this field, right? We access one of them. It's helpful for the companies that don't have their own business, right? A book of business. The large insurers have their own sort of data, but they'll still buy this data as well, and they'll look at it, sometimes incorporating it. And insurance brokers use the data to justify coverage recommendations to the client, right? So when we're pitching a client, we can say we have 30 or 40 other retail healthcare organizational clients that we work with. They have a similar profile from a revenue standpoint, record standpoint, control standpoint, right? And then they use that as a way to launch into a recommendation. So that's one category, right? The sort of providers that sort of harvest and get this data together. Then you have insurance information security companies, which I mentioned, that do aggregate risk analysis, okay? They're relying a lot on big data, but they're focused on modeling aggregate or systemic risk, looking at worst case scenarios for insurers, okay? They're trying to translate the data analytics into risk avoidance and cost containment very often, right? Here's a nice quote to highlight that, right? I think the common language is dollars and probabilities. Here's an insurer talking about this. And that's what the boardroom can respond to. If I'm an IT tech guy and I come to you and say we have 2 million botnets on our network and 500 high severity vulnerabilities, and you're a board member, you're looking at me and say, I have no clue what that means. But if you come to me and say, we believe there's a 1% chance that we have these events occur in the next 12 months, and that worst case scenario is $1 billion loss, that's a much different conversation. That's the way you corral resources and start to actually manage the risk, manage the exposure, and not have the kind of blindsiding type events, okay? So as you see here, technology and big data tools in this aggregate risk analysis space are driving or attempting to drive insurance sales process by translating aggregate risk into a language buyers of insurance understand. Buyers of insurance understand profits, potential profits, and potential losses, right? And that's what this quote is highlighting, that sort of a conversion of how they talk about this in that space. How that data gets mobilized is into a conversation about potential profits and losses. All right, so that's category 2. Category 3 is much more centered on the actual organization, the prospective buyer of cyber insurance, right? Information security companies are assisting insurers in evaluating the risk of particular insureds through cyber health evaluations and scans. There's many companies in this space doing this, right? They're using high-end security and tech tools, endpoint vulnerability assessments, scanning the dark web, and issuing a rating or score, right? Most using external scans, a couple claiming they're using internal scans. And the argument here is, trying to assist with underwriting and evaluating the client's cyber hygiene. Is this a good risk? Is this a bad risk? And, what's their, how safe are they, if you will? Their health. Think of it as health, right? There's a cottage industry of sort of companies in this space, if you will, and they're looking at a particular company and their vulnerability, their patching cadence, et cetera. And they're telling you more specifically about the individual. The insurers we spoke with believe that the scores increase their efficiency and accuracy in pricing and render the insurance application, the filling out of the forms less important, right? And that's what this quote highlights. If somebody has a good cyber hygiene, I can rely on that third-party data to help me. Makes it more convenient for the customer. They don't have to fill out the lengthy application, not have to worry about the person filling out the application if they understand the question I ask them. Are they just checking yes to avoid a bad outcome? It's more accurate, it's more granular. I can set my pricing accordingly, right? So there's a sort of a third approach. AI is in play. It's still at early stages. I'm not going to talk as much about that because I want to keep moving, but I do want to note that the information security providers that we spoke with, some of them say, we're using AI to assist insurers in building predictive models to enhance efficiencies in the underwriting process, right? So you got these 3 different ways here. They're managing uncertainty with technology, and then they're also engaging in risk management and loss prevention through a series of tools, right? So this insurance isn't just about risk transfer according to the cyber insurance field. They're trying to engage in risk management and prevent risks, detect, prevent, and to the extent a risk occurs, try to mitigate or reduce it, right? And they do this through a series of pre-breach and post-breach services, right? And in doing so, they play somewhat of a de facto regulatory role, given the lack of strong legal regulations and the organizational under-preparation for cyber and security incidents. Now, this slide in my earlier paper in 2018 kind of dives into this a little more deeply. But on the left side here are these sort of pre-breach services, if you will, that the insurers are offering. Things like password management, virus scanning, most importantly, consultation with forensic and information security companies that they contract with, and a series of other things, right? On the response side, once the breach does occur, there are post-breach services in the form of insurance companies are bundling together access to law firms, forensics companies, credit monitoring companies, and reputation or crisis management who are specialists in how to deal with these kinds of things so that you get access to that. So pre-breach, post-breach, you're again anchored through technology, right? In the form of forensics, information security companies. So, I always like to show this. You say, whoa, what is this? I mean, I can't take credit for this slide. I'm sort of lifting it, if you will, but this highlights the technicalization of insurance in one slide, right? You see, these are all companies. And when you go to these cyber conferences, this is what it looks like. People walking around from all these different vendors: web security, endpoint security, data security, mobile security, security, threat intelligence, right? You see the intersection of technology, security, and insurance in these conferences, right? Like, this is, in some sense, the technicalization on one slide, right? And these are companies, right? These are businesses, all kinds, right? So then you say, okay, you've mapped the space for me. What's the effects or implications? And well, we say, at this stage, there's work to be done, right? Our research suggests, somewhat surprisingly, that InsurTech interventions may have benefits for efficiency purposes, but they're ineffective at enhancing organization cybersecurity, right? To the extent they're attempting to fill a regulatory void, they're not doing so necessarily effectively, right? Big data, in some sense, is an unreliable tool, according to many we spoke with in the field, right? It's limited, it's not always accurate. The quality and the sources are often limited and paint an incomplete picture. There's an over-reliance on publicly available information. Because cyber insurance lacks a mandated, standardized, and centralized line of reporting, no source of information is complete, and disparate sources contain different types or amounts of data, right? And in fact, the information can be very selective and unrepresentative, because large insurers are not often sharing their data, right? Here's an insurer right here. We're not going to give a data provider our data. A lot of insurers don't want stuff to go out in the public. They're not publicly traded. They don't have an answer to a regulator. They're going to close it out. They'll do notification, unless somebody writes a newspaper article. Your big data provider isn't going to find out about it. They're throwing darts. Most of the stuff is done under privilege of counsel, right? So, they're just trying to bring in data from any point they can get, but it's still early in the ball game. It's really hard to get there. And the issue is the credibility and the source of the data, right? Others, as I said earlier, the brokers often use these big data provider data for benchmarking. Well, many in the industry are really critical about this benchmarking style, because it's backward looking, right? It's offering benchmark recommendations on making policy limit recommendations based on events in the past that don't account for changing cyber threats patterns, right? Many in the industry critique this. They give me some benchmarking. Well, I get so angry when I hear that. You've got this evolving threatscape in front of you, and you're going to drive the car by looking in the rearview mirror to see what the clowns behind you, who are just as blind as you, are doing. It's crazy. I would say no, benchmarking is useless. Do a ground up analysis, right? Data benchmarking to value not reliable. Okay, don't rely on it exclusively. Okay, so we hear this over and over, right? This sort of critique, if you will, about big data. So then you say, well, we looked at our database, and our sense was, there's value. There's a lot of information there, and there's some good things going on. But it's also being used. Our sense was that used by brokers and underwriters to nudge clients toward purchasing more insurance. In part, the simulations don't always discount outliers, and that seems to be a bit of an issue. Throughout our analysis, the various peer groups in the database consistently included outlier loss amounts experienced by companies in a particular peer group in presentations of the data, through figures, and in calculations of key summary statistics, right? In other words, the database inflates the potential cost of loss and nudges buyers of insurance to purchase more limits, right? Here's a figure that shows how not discounting outliers impacts insurance policy limit recommendations for prospective buyers of insurance, right? After users select an industry type and revenue range, premium, limits, the database will present a chart that reveal prior loss amounts experienced by and median limits of companies in the selected peer group. Okay, and that's what this is showing. However, when plotting this information, the database does not discount low or high outliers, especially when there's a high outlier. A visual inspection of the plot suggests the company may experience a loss that's much higher than the average, and that would thus significantly raise the insurance policy limits. Here, with the hypothetical $1 million limit, when you don't discount this outlier here, loss right here, here's the $1 million limit right here, the blue line. The average loss amount in excess according to this simulation, is 9 million. Okay, that's pretty high. That suggests that having a 1 million policy is not enough for the average loss estimate. Well, what does it look like when you take the outlier out? Well, then it starts to suggest that, without including the outlier, the average loss amount is about 15 times less than the average loss amount calculated with the outlier. And therefore, the client's selected limit of $1 million, which is the orange line here, would at first glance seem fairly appropriate, right? And so, this was a concern. There were other concerns. We don't have time to go into it, but I will say that it mirrored a lot of what we heard from the field, the insurance field, which is that the sense from the field is that the experts are that it's being used to manage uncertainty and nudge buyers toward a higher limit because the data serves a legitimization tool where actuarial data is spare or missing. Right? Here's the industry's perspective on it. We manage the uncertainty by showing the peer data, by showing them our models, sort of nudge the client into understanding what the recommendation is. We use these databases to get them over the starting line to make the purchase. And this last quote is a real sort of highlights the sort of how these databases are used to legitimate broker recommendations, right? And then the client will say, well, prove it. And so he'll show the big data provider's data, and you can put in a healthcare company with such and such revenue and spit out a chart. Well, okay, here are 5 companies similarly situated to yours, and here are the limits of that. Present that, okay, and nudge the client into understanding what the recommendation is with respect to the policy limit that the insurance broker is recommending. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing if the data is reliable and the quality and the source and all those things we raised earlier, the concerns, right? But there are concerns about, the quality of the data, where the data is coming from, is it complete, et cetera, et cetera. So it leaves something to be desired, right? And many say that, look, our numbers are more conservative, lower than what the data provider's numbers come at. So there's this sense that the numbers being presented by the data don't necessarily align with what everybody else in the industry is seeing. So there's a little bit of a disjointedness there. Security scans, well, many in the field say, look, they don't tell us as much as we think. It's not going inside the insurance network. It's a proxy. It's a theory. I wouldn't say it's proven. There's often false positives. That's what a lot of people said, or what are called honeypots, or sometimes organizations purposely, leave a threat out there purposely to try to sort of lure in these cyber attackers into a space. And that's not being captured from the security scans. Other things we noted from these scans is that insurers are not sharing the information with the insured regarding the cyber hygiene of the organization based on the security scan evaluation. So there's a real chance to improve the cybersecurity health there that gets lost, right? They often don't even disclose to the buyer that they're conducting a scan or test. And this is all coming from the field itself. I'm not making this up. This is from our interviews, essentially. We asked this question virtually of everybody that we interviewed, rarely require changes as a prerequisite to issuing insurance or gaining lower premiums. And they said, and they often tout the reason for that as well. It's a soft market. Carriers are trying to get in. We're worried if we require the prospective buyer to make changes, they're going to go somewhere else to get their insurance, right? And the scans are not continuous throughout the policy, typically. It's a snapshot in time early on in the space, if you will. So coming back to those pre-breach services that I showed you, that fancy slide with all the blue boxes, et cetera. Well, turns out, according to the people we talked to, buyers rarely use these pre-breach services, even though they sound like they could actually possibly help prevent or lower the chance of a breach event. The uptake rate is very low. Over and over, people said less than 10% of the buyers of insurance use these pre-breach services that insurance companies market. It's a great marketing tool because we're better than the other guys. Look how much free stuff you're getting with us, but the uptake is less than 10%, right? Reasons, some don't trust insurer-sponsored services, the price, or underestimating the risk of cybersecurity incidences, right? Insurers also seem unwilling to require, as I said, insureds to adopt these pre-breach services. So there's, again, an opportunity for insurers to engage in a regulatory intervention, but due to the soft market, they don't. And they rarely verify or check what's listed on the insurance application, right? Now, in organizations are using those post-breach services, okay, which is good. In the event of an actual breach, they are using those post-breach services. But the downside, of course, is that's after the breach event has occurred. So it's unlikely to sort of improve society's overall cybersecurity posture, but it does suggest that cyber insurers could actually have a positive regulatory impact with the right incentive structure possibly in place. Okay, I'm going to skip how even the reliance on these technological tools goes all the way up to regulators. Okay, rating agencies are working with regulators and rating are working with the very same information that security providers use to develop their own risk and rating. And this quote really highlights that point. Basically, the information security provider is telling us that, yeah, the state regulators rely on our information. So the content and meaning of the regulations are being, shaped by the very information security providers who are developing this information. Okay, so there are problems, right? I don't want to leave you in my final few moments with all doom and gloom. There is a possible pathway forward, and part of the pathway forward is to actually eliminate or mitigate some of the problems we just identified in the prior section's presentation, right? Our paper sort of concludes by saying, look, I think there's some things that can be done to help mitigate some of these problems, like engaging in continuous evaluation and underwriting throughout the life of a cyber policy, rewarding good behavior by an organization with reduced premiums, okay, requiring possibly insureds to make changes to improve their cybersecurity posture as a prerequisite to issuing insurance, and engaging in more dynamic or ongoing risk management and loss prevention, as opposed to just offering pre-breach services that no one's really using. Fortunately, there are actually a couple of companies that are fully integrated insurtech companies. They're actually starting to do some of these things. And we note that at the end of our paper briefly, just to show there's some pathways here. Unlike the traditional insurance companies that contract with third-party vendors to provide security analysis, these companies are embedding the technology and security within the insurance company. That's why I refer to this as full integration. And they're incorporating some of these features, right? AtBay and Coalition, I talk about them in the paper. You can read about it. They often partner with larger insurers, but they're sort of young insurtech companies who are engaging, in some of the sort of 1 through 4 a little bit, some of at least 1 through 4. Whereas policies are traditionally locked in for a year, they engage in continuous underwriting. The scanning that occurs is not just in advance of the issuing of the policy, but they're conducting real-time scanning. They're building in their continuous pre-breach monitoring into the actual insurance itself, and engaging in simultaneous risk transfer and management. And they are tying premium pricing to existing risk and loss control measures in order to reward the insurers for lower premiums for heightened security, right? This quote is highlighting sort of this perspective on tying premium price to existing risk and loss control measures, right? I asked the question, if a company says, if I make these changes, can you give me an improved price? Has that experience occurred? It happens quite often, more often. For example, the recommendation that we ask them is we ask them to add a security email gateway like Barracuda, et cetera, et cetera. And we give them broader coverage. We have this every day. We have people coming back saying, we've added something, we've improved something, we changed our configuration. Can you give us better terms? And by the way, most of the time they do it before they buy the insurance. So they get the first quote from us, they make the fix, we improve the offer, we bind the insurance. Right. So despite the soft market, there is a space for some of this to occur, right? Real-time scanning and evaluating the cyber hygiene of the insured through the length of the policy. And here's another insurtech talking about this. Once a company's in our portfolio, we use the exact same underwriting engine that we used to provide the quote in the beginning of the policy. We run that engine once a month. And that'll shoot up an alert. We have a security team who reach out, say, look, we sold you the policy. We're not trying to get more money from you. We're on the hook to pay most of it, but you're on the hook too. We're seeing this new attack come in and we're seeing you vulnerable. Here are the details of where the attack is. Here's your specific machine that's vulnerable. Our team is here at your disposal to fix it. Right? We're just going one by one. And whenever there's a new alert, new critical vulnerability, it flows from the research team to the model. The model runs the portfolio to our clients, spits out alerts, and the security team just helps the companies fix the issue. right? So there are ways to better situate technology to work toward better cybersecurity hygiene. I think these insurtech companies reflect the future of insurance per the comments of people that we spoke to, which is what this quote sort of highlights here. This is the future of insurance. It's going to be managed security with insurance attached to it. Okay. And so, in conclusion here, insurance's de facto regulators isn't great so far. There are problems, right? The soft market, the unreliability of big data, the unreliability of information security provider scanners, the reluctance to reward good cyber citizens with lower premiums or to punish those unwilling or unable, the low uptake on the pre-breach services, etc. But there's possible hope in the form of sort of eliminating some of these problems through perhaps full integration, right? And it brings us back to the larger questions I started with, which is, should insurers be given deference to regulate organizational behavior? That's an open question. I have thoughts on that. Deference, should there be deference given to them by public legal institutions? And again, more broadly, thinking about insurance on a continuum. Insurance has regulation on a continuum. It's not always bad. It's not always good. It's under what conditions, right? And here we are exploring those conditions in this study, right? And so, at a minimum, thinking about using technology to reprioritize organizational and consumer safety and security in heightened ways, as opposed to, efficiency and cost containment, which are important. Don't get me wrong, especially from an organization standpoint, but thinking more broadly about, can we calibrate safety and security into that in an improved manner, if you will. So thank you for listening. And I guess now I'll open it up for questions. I'll let Sean sort of coordinate this.
Yeah, so we don't have any. One just popped into the Q&A, but there was one that came through with the chat that I'll bring up first that we will bring over. So Shannon says, Treasury pays insurers back for up to $5 million per event if a cyber attack is caused by terrorism. Did this come up in your data? In healthcare and some other sectors, cyber breaches risk human life, e.g. ransomware shutting down hospitals. Did this come up into your data? And Brian mentioned that he was going to be able to help contribute to this one as well, if you wanted to share.
Yeah, Brian, you want to take that question?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, what you're referring to is the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, which, as luck would have it, I was present at the creation of. I was working at the National Security Council at the time. Shows you how old I am. There's a couple of issues with that when you're talking about cyber attacks. One is, as you point out, Treasury did clarify a few years ago that an act of terrorism, if certified to be an act of terrorism by the Secretary, could be a cyber attack. However, one, the entire law only applies to standalone cyber policies. Treasury has clarified that, not to other types of policies that have cyber coverage. The bigger problem is that the law doesn't kick in at all until the damage is above $200 million. And it's literally never been used, even in a physical terrorism context. The other issue, of course, and this is something we're working on for a follow-on paper, is all the difficulties in cyberspace of attributing an attack. Can you prove who did the attack? Was it a government? As you probably know, a couple insurers are now trying to get out of coverage by claiming active war exclusions. And, for example, the Russian NotPetya attack on Ukraine a few years ago that went bad and hit lots of other people around the world. Would that be an act of terrorism? Secretary of Treasury would have to confirm that. So I don't think it's a very good solution right now, but one of the things we're looking at is whether or not that law or another law could be amended to make it more appropriate for these types of cyber acts of terror.
Thanks. Asaf asks, so you support fully integrated companies, fully integrated in quotes. Are there no concerns about conflict of interest when insurers adopt this model? A security company has a particular business model that is rooted in selling more cybersecurity solutions, and those might not always be aligned with the good faith and fair dealings of obligations of insurers.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the way I look at it is sort of compared to what, right? These information security providers who are not connected formally with insurance companies, who are essentially contracting with, their relationship is with the insurance company, right? They're not necessarily reaching the client. So they're from that standpoint, I think those companies don't have as much risk at stake on their own. The fully integrated companies, as the quote highlighted, they're on the hook. So their incentive structure is to make sure that their customers are as cyber secure as possible. So whereas a lot of insurance companies market the pre-breach services, they don't really, ultimately, once they buy the insurance, it doesn't really matter to them necessarily. It doesn't seem like it matters. The uptake rate is 10%. Whereas the fully integrated insurance company has an active interest in making sure that those pre-breach services are in fact incorporated, and they are rewarding consumers or buyers with lower premiums. I think the key distinction here that I want to point out here is the fully integrated insurtech companies aren't necessarily doing anything too different than what I presented in the opening part about technicalization, where insurance companies are partnering with information security companies. They're scanning the dark web, they're looking at endpoint vulnerability assessments, et cetera, et cetera. The difference is in how it's fully integrated in the insurance and how they operationalize this. They're engaging in continuous evaluation and scans, not just one time at the time of the purchase of insurance. They're engaging in continuous pre-breach monitoring. They are wedding themselves closer to the client, and in some sense, reducing the risk and rewarding consumers who engage in better cyber health. So they're eliminating some of those problems that we identified. I had a slide here, right here. They're doing some of these things here that were a lot of the problems with the way the mainstream cyber insurance field are using. So I'm not necessarily saying that fully integrated insurtech companies are perfect. And in fact, the paper, we expressly say that. But to the extent they're doing some of these things, right? Continuous underwriting, continuous evaluation, rewarding good behavior. Let's do that. Requiring changes before issuing insurance. To the extent they're doing some of those things, I think that's an improvement. So it's always compared to what, right? What you have right now is a field of information security providers that I showed you in that slide that are just pitching their services. Whether it's actually improving cybersecurity, open question, especially if the uptake is less than 10%. So I think you got to think about it on a continuum. I don't think fully integrated is perfect. I don't think I'm championing that, but I do think doing some of these things on the slide right now are, I think, a step in the right direction. And I think that's the way to think about it. So I think that's the way I would sort of frame what we're saying here.
Great. And just as a reminder, we have about another 5 minutes. We can take questions. Julie asks, much of what you talked about involves technical controls. Has there been any thought about insurers pushing companies towards any non-technical controls? For example, security awareness training to positively influence employee behaviors. If so, do they recommend ways to measure effectiveness beyond those number of people completing the training?
I can take that one real quick, Julie. That's a great question. I've been a cybersecurity lawyer and practitioner for a long time, and it's still the case that a huge percentage of successful cyber attacks are not technical at all. They involve tricking people into doing dumb things. And so, to your question, I think that what the current prevailing model is still, you hand out questionnaires to your potential insureds, they fill them out, and you just take their word for it until something goes wrong, and then you may try to verify. Typically, those questions, I shouldn't say typically, in a lot of cases, those questions will include questions about training, but the problem is then there's no follow-up typically to monitor whether or not the training's happening unless there's an incident and you have to go back and try to deny coverage. So one thing that these insurtech companies could do, or traditional insurers could do, is monitor, or at least have an ongoing question about whether or not the training's taking place, how many people took it, how many people passed, did they have to take it multiple times? As far as I know, Shaheen may correct me if our data shows otherwise, I don't think many companies are doing that.
I think that's right. But one thing I want to add to what Brian said, Julian, it's a great question. Outside the scope of this paper, but one of the big findings that we found, and we'll talk about this in a different paper, is human error. People always talked about this. A lot of this comes back to old-fashioned human error. And so the idea, your point about sort of non-technical solutions and training, and is a point that needs to be pushed going forward in the reform, in thinking about reforms going forward. But human error and sort of just human mistakes, basic errors, the things Brian's mentioning, was a finding that was repetitively emphasized. So this is a slice of a larger project, but I think that's a really good point, and it's something we don't discount.
Great. So I'm going to take moderator prerogative and ask a question of my own here. And one of the things I thought that was fascinating was when you were talking about this dialogue between insurance brokers and companies, how they can talk about what is being communicated at the C-suite. So instead of having more technically specific things, number of attacks per day, these sorts of things, that would be changed to something like you've got a 1% chance of having an event that could have $1 billion impact. And I'm wondering about how that might affect these sorts of benefit or non-benefit for the company, and how they also communicate to external parties, whether that's regulators, stockbrokers, these sorts of things, where they might not have to disclose or feel they disclose the technical aspects of their information and systems, the security that they have. Instead, they can communicate it in these softer terms. And are insurers playing a role in how they do those sorts of external communications?
I would say, I think insurers and brokers are playing a role in that translational, the translation of the terminology, the way I highlighted in the quote that you're picking up on, Sean, whether that, carries forward outside of the, negotiation between, let's say, the prospective buyer, the broker, and the carrier, I'm not as sure. Brian, do you have a take on that?
Well, yeah, I have two thoughts on that. One is, doing cybersecurity law in private practice, one of the big surprises I found was that's one of the most important roles that lawyers and to some extent cybersecurity consultants play, is translating the language of the IT, suite to the language of the C-suite. It's just a really important thing that has to happen. And to the extent that insurance process does that, I think it's valuable. However, if I'm a general counsel, especially of a publicly traded company, in some ways, the last thing I want, right, is some kind of record of, oh, you're at 60% risk of $1 billion event. So I don't think we studied this in our paper, but my guess anecdotally is just that some of that process is going to get mixed up with the lawyers in any company, and they may not actually want that data in their files.
Thanks. The last couple of questions and comments will come from Shannon as we round out then. Methodologically, it would be interesting to examine how SolarWinds impacts insurance buying, a econometric identification strategy of a quasi-random event. Does history have anything analogous to teach us about this? What other major tech innovations have rocked the insurer business model and functions?
Brian, you want to handle this one, or you want?
Yeah, let me take the second part first. So the biggest example of the deficiencies of the insurance market driving at least legal change in my memory is the nuclear power industry. Around the time of 3 Mile Island, which most people on this call are probably too young to remember, but it happened in the late 70s, nuclear accident, Pennsylvania, maybe, I'm not sure. The Congress passed a law essentially indemnifying nuclear power companies and creating a massive federal backstop. And in fact, again, one of our follow-on things is to look at whether or not that's a model that we can think about for cyber insurance as well. I forget the first part of the question, sorry. Yeah, I do think, now I'm reading Shannon's question. I do think that part of the reason why insurers have had to step into this breach is, particularly in the United States, but even in Europe, even though they'll say otherwise, there really isn't any comprehensive cybersecurity, privacy, regulatory framework that crosses all industries. And Congress is constantly looking at that. If they ever get that squared away, it's going to go a long way to helping this. The problem, of course, is that the minute the ink dries on any new law, the technology and the attack methods and the defense methods have already changed. The advantage of the insurance industry is they can be much more nimble and adapt much more quickly than federal law could. Shaheen, you had something you want to add?
No, I think that covers it. I'm trying to respond to Maruk's Madad's comment in the chat. But no, I think that covers it.
Shaheen, thank you for trying to get that last question then sent via text to Makrud. Then I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. I hope you found this to be informative and exciting to follow their work. This is work in progress, so look for it to be published in the near future. I want to give a quick then shout to our next upcoming speaker is going to be Rebecca Slayton. She's an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. The tentative date for this, is we're still finalizing the time, will be Thursday, the 11th of March. And we're going between one of two topics. If you like one of these and you'd like to see it more, let me know. It'll either be on the emergence of US military cyber expertise or on trusting infrastructure, the emergence of computer security incident responses. So definitely fitting into our socio-technical narrative space here. And at that point, I will say thank you for coming. And those of you that are staying for the after chat, please carry over. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.